All right, everybody in Econ 100B land, intermediate micro students. Today I want to go over a couple more homework questions. I'm going to break them up into short videos. It just makes it a little bit easier. Hopefully that helps you find what you're looking for. For this problem, I'm going to go over the problem from Chapter 3, question number 9. It's also question 3.2 in the text. You'll find that, and it usually will say that in the online homework, so keep that in mind, that a lot of the homework problems in my lab are also in the textbook. But this was the one that someone asked about in class, talking about low-end and high-end tequila and agave. And so it says, will Mexico stop producing tequila because of record low industry prices for the agave azul plant, from which tequila is distilled? Farmers in Jalisco and other Mexican states are switching to more lucrative plants, according to an article that they referenced there. Planting agave rose substantially from 2000 to 2004 and then started to plummet when the price of inexpensive tequila fell. The number of agave planted went from 60 million in 2000, 93 million in 2002, and then 12.8 million in 2006, and the downward trend continues into 2007. It takes 7 years for an agave plant to reach maturity and be harvestable. The price of inexpensive tequila has dropped from 35% to 40% in recent years, but the price of high-end tequila has not changed in spite of growing demand. Has remained stable. Discuss the relative sizes of short-run and long-run price elasticities. And so then our 3 questions come in here. And so all these questions are answered in that paragraph, but you have to pull out what they're talking about, and that's what I'm going to try and do. So the first question asks about the difference between the short-run and long-run elasticity. Compare the long-run supply elasticity of tequila. The short-run elasticity is likely what? And then there's a bunch of options. More elastic, less elastic, and then why? Is it more elastic because producers invest in because producers invest to maximize profits in the long run? Is it more elastic because producers seek to maximize profits in the short run? Or is it less elastic because producers have more time to change their behavior? Less elastic or more inelastic because producers are less price sensitive than to consumers, or more inelastic because price cannot immediately affect supply? And the answer to this question comes from the sentence in here that says, it takes 7 years for an agave plant to be ready for harvesting. That tells us that it's going to affect the price elasticity of supply, right? If I want to produce more tequila tomorrow and I plant agave for that today, I will have to wait 7 years. So we're going to expect this price elasticity of supply in the short run to be less than the long run. So compared to the long run elasticity of tequila, the short run supply elasticity is likely to be more inelastic. And it's not because of consumers or producers really changing their behavior. That's a little bit of a misleading answer, the inelastic because producers have more time to change behavior. The reality is, in the short run, they have less time to change their behavior, and because price can't immediately affect supply. There's a 7-year lag on supply. So the correct answer is that the short-run supply elasticity is probably more inelastic because price can't affect supply right away. There's a 7-year lag. Make sense? Hopefully. The next question says, the supply elasticity of high-quality tequila is almost perfectly inelastic because price is decreased, almost perfectly inelastic because the quantity is decreased, almost perfectly elastic because the quantity has remained unchanged, unitary elastic because the price and quantity have not changed, or almost perfectly elastic because the price has remained unchanged. So let's read again what they say about high quality tequila. The price of inexpensive tequila has dropped from 35% to 40%. But the price of high-end tequilas, which have grown in popularity, has remained stable. So what does that tell us? Let's graph the parts we know and see if that answers our question for us. Okay, so we're talking about the high-end tequila, and we have the quantity and price, and it says that demand has grown, right, despite growing popularity. So that means it's become increasingly popular. That tells us that the demand curve has shifted out. right? That's increasing popularity. That's how we would graph that. And then it also says the price of high-end tequilas, which have been growing in popularity, has remained stable. So if the price isn't changing, what does that tell us about the supply curve? Well, if the price stays the same, even though we have an increase in demand, that tells us that supply may likely be perfectly elastic because there's no change, right? We can there we go. We can expect that supply of high-end tequila might be perfectly elastic because the price has remained unchanged in the face of growing demand. Okay, so that's part 2. The last question asks, assuming the demand curve for inexpensive tequila has remained unchanged, the demand curve for inexpensive tequila must be relatively elastic or relatively inelastic, and then why? So let's go back to the part where we talk about cheap tequila. In my notes, I'm calling it Jose Cuervo. So they say, okay, the price of inexpensive tequila has dropped in recent years. And we want to say, assuming the demand hasn't changed, what must the demand curve for inexpensive tequila be? So if we are looking again at the graph, which I think is the easier way to think of this, we'll call this low-end tequila. And we have a situation where the price is dropping and we're assuming that the demand curve hasn't changed. And that's all the information we have, right? The price of inexpensive tequila dropped in recent years. And that's all we know. So we've had a big drop in tequila. So what might that mean? It means we're going to go from price 1 here to price 2 very far. If demand was very elastic, that would have a really big effect on the quantity demanded. We're assuming we have one demand curve here. And so we want to know where that's going to make the most sense. Is it going to be a very flat demand curve or a very steep demand curve, right? If demand for tequila has remained relatively unchanged, then we can assume that the demand curve for inexpensive tequila is relatively inelastic because there's a big change in the price and not a very big change in demand. Let's do it this way. Does that kind of make sense? If we had a big change in demand in response to that big change in price, then we would have a much more elastic demand curve. Consumers of low-end or inexpensive tequila would be responding to that price change in buying a lot more of it, but we don't see that. And so assuming the demand curve for inexpensive tequila has remained relatively unchanged, the demand curve for inexpensive tequila must be relatively inelastic because the drop in price is large, right? Hopefully that helps you understand it. Again, with those kinds of questions, it's a little bit tricky. And so I think it's useful to go through and say, okay, what's this question asking? And then what part of the sort of word problem is answering that question? So I hope that helps. Let me know what questions you have.